Welcome back, everyone. Some of you were here for last week, and some of you weren't, so we're going to do a little bit of a review of what we covered. In any event, because we are reading through some lectionary portions from the book of Job this month, it seems appropriate to take some time to reflect on the book of Job, since it's a peculiar book, popularly, in the sense that everybody knows about it, but it turns out everybody knows almost nothing about it, and certainly almost no one actually reads it. Okay, that's the peculiar thing about the book of Job. So we'll do a little bit of review here to get ourselves squared away, and then today we'll explore the middle portion of the book of Job. So I'm going to remind you, the book of Job is composed essentially of three easily identifiable sections. Section 1 is a prose narrative that we'll review a little bit, that sets up the story, and it sets up the issues that's going to be treated by the book of Job at large. Second section is quite different stylistically. The second section of the book of Job is written in beautiful poetry that's probably Hebrew. It certainly resembles Hebrew, but it is a very different Hebrew from what you find in the rest of the Old Testament. More about that. And the third section of the book of Job again returns to prose style, and it concludes things, or maybe it doesn't. And you're going to have to come back next week to see more about that open question. So let's do a little bit of review. I'm going to have to get myself situated here. So the Joban motif, the book fits in with other ancient writings. This is a bit from last week. The book of Job takes up a theme. In fact, it's so frequent, we call it the Joban motif. The Joban motif is that idea of a righteous person, respected and enjoying good circumstances, undergoes inexplicable suffering, and then there is a wrestling with why did this happen and how can it be fixed. That's what we might call the Joban motif. And in that sense, the book of Job is right at home with a surprising number of other ancient writings, and not just in the ancient Near East, but in other parts of the world where they had literary traditions altogether. At the same time, the book of Job is unlike what we find elsewhere in the Old Testament. I alluded to this just a moment ago. The Hebrew is distinctive. When someone's reading out loud, and I don't know where you would hear that, but you would be hearing somebody reading the Hebrew Bible out loud, and you could tell that's Job, because the Hebrew just, wow, what's that word again? It's striking Hebrew. It's also distinct from other parts of the Old Testament, and this is actually critical. This next point is critical to the meaning or the sense of the book of Job, and that it's different in that the rest of the Old Testament talks about the relationship between Yahweh or God and Israel. Book of Job doesn't talk about that ever. Book of Job doesn't mention Israel ever. Book of Job doesn't mention Sinai, doesn't mention covenant, doesn't mention any of the institutional or major particular theological entities that you find on every other page of the Old Testament. It's just not in the book of Job, with one exception, and that exception is going to become very clear as we proceed in today's session. The book of Job is also both true and untrue. This is something we covered last week. The book of Job is untrue because it could not possibly have happened as narrated. What couldn't possibly have happened? The dialogue in heaven, where God is engaging with the sons of God, wherever they are, and then the Satan, remember the Satan? We're going to unpack that a little bit more. God and the Satan have this dialogue among themselves. Well, who is there to record that? You see what I mean? So obviously, this is a literary construct. The book of Job is a literary construct. There are other factors, by the way, about the style of the book of Job that makes it pretty obvious. Folks, we're dealing with an elegant and carefully crafted literary construct here, but not necessarily a report of what actually happened. However, at the same time, the book of Job is very true, uber true, because the book of Job, you recall, is about every man. Job is actually a persona. Job is a representative of what happens in this world to good people, or actually to all people. That's why I say every man. And this is, by the way, the Jobin motif is quite widespread, as I said. In that sense, books of this sort are very, very true, irrespective of their historical or even scientific truth. And we Christians, by the way, shouldn't balk at that, because Jesus made a specialty of teaching through literary genres like that, called parables, which are untrue. You see, they didn't happen. There is no field buried in the pearl buried in the field. But they're quite true in the sense of the message that they're recommending, the meaning that Jesus is conveying. You see, true and untrue. Also, the book of Job is a story with characters whose lines state the issues. This is what I meant before. The characters are there simply to lay out, here are the issues, here are the themes, here are the ideas that the story as a whole is going to be wrestling with. So, case in point, here is a medieval depiction of the devil and a medieval depiction of God. And in this part of the story, we recognize that the way the Hebrew formulates the reference to this devilish figure is not devilish at all. It's ha-satan in Hebrew, which is a designation of this person has a role in the heavenly council. This person has the role to test, to evaluate, ha-satan. And so this Satan figure or the Satan figure and God are talking, and God says, have you seen my servant Job? You go around evaluating people. Have you evaluated Job yet? And God recommends to the Satan, check him out. He's full of piety. He's very faithful to me. He will pass any test you give him. And the Satan comes back and says, well, yeah, he is pious because you have purchased his piety with the blessings that you have bestowed upon him. Take away those blessings and we'll find out how pious Job truly is. This is the famous story that we know from the book of Job, right? My point is, the truth of the book doesn't rest on whether this is the devil or not. I will remind you that after this sequence of conversations, the Satan character disappears from the book altogether. Folks, that's a signal that the Satan figure is not critical to the meaning of the book. It's a character to articulate lines. This happens a lot in Hebrew narrative, in the Pentateuch, and in other parts of the Old Testament. So this conversation goes on. Satan, the Satan, does afflict Job. He kills his children. His children die. His wealth is taken away from him. He is devastated in his estate, and so he is now poverty-stricken and without children. And God says to Satan, Job has maintained his integrity even with unjust calamity. Now, I want to emphasize something that gets glossed over all the time. Pointed this out last week. Even in unjust calamity, Job has maintained his integrity, which he did. He said, okay, I came into this world naked, I'll leave the world naked, blessed be the name of the Lord. Okay, passes the test, right? I want to emphasize the phrase God uses, something that we're just going to gloss over. God says, when you prompted me, Satan, to afflict him chinam, without cause. Okay, that's blatant, and it's directly from the mouth of God. Without cause, this guy has been brought to suffer. Well, that tells the reader, we're going to be deliberating this without cause thing, as you'll see. The Satan comes back and says, well, yeah, but if you afflict his body, and if he suffers long enough in his physical organism, he'll cave in. He'll just deny you altogether. Job's wife agrees with the Satan, and she says, as things just get worse and worse and worse, he says, how long are you going to do this pious thing? How long are you going to maintain this thing, this integrity in the face of calamity? Curse God, who has obviously afflicted you without cause, and die. This would be a noble response, by the way, in some moral systems of how to respond to calamity. Job says, well, shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not also the evil? This is one way of maintaining integrity, saying God is the giver of good and as well as the giver of evil. So Job is saying God's God. God's not necessarily all good. God also has an evil side, and we get whatever God decides to give us. That's one response. The same Hebrew formulation, can be translated entirely differently, and this is the lovely part about much of Hebrew writing is its ambiguity. Because you can also translate this, it is only the good that we receive from God, and not the evil. Now, this is the same Hebrew phrase, but it's ambiguous enough to understand both ways. In this response, Job is saying, only good comes from God. The evil that I'm afflicting does not come from God. And so cursing God wouldn't be ineffective and off target. Okay. Now, you recall we had a triangle last week about the goodness of God and suffering and so forth, and we'll come back to that to understand his response. In any event, this is a struggle over monotheism. If we have one God who is responsible for everything, and this is a theological premise behind this book, can that align with human experience? If there is only one God, how can human experience relate to a God who might decide to bring good and might decide to bring evil? Since there is no other authority that decides these things. That's a monotheism, you see? One God. So this is pressing the question of monotheism. This is what the book of Job is doing. And so Job responds as possibly a radical monotheist. This response, God gives both the evil and the good. That is a very strict monotheistic position. Good or bad, it comes from God. An alternate position is good comes from God, bad comes from the devil is a handy source. So let's start talking about the devil. And sometimes Christians do this, okay? So the prologue of the book, which we've just been reviewing, sets up the issues of the book. This is then an issue of talking about God. In all this, the narrator says, Job did not sin with his lips. He did not speak badly about God. So that's a signal that this story is about theology, about talking about God. So his three friends arrive, and they're eventually joined by a fourth. We are joined by Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, and a little bit later, Elihu. And these are people that come, and they mourn with Job a little while, and then they start talking with him. He will explode in his own soliloquy in just a moment, but they will arrive, and they will begin to articulate various ways of understanding this core question about how do we speak about God and human suffering. So we're clear on the issues, right? This is how the prologue of the book sets things up. It's almost like the book is saying, are we clear on the issues? And the reader says, yes, I think so. And so we turn the page, and Job begins to lament. He has a chapter-long, one chapter expression of basically, why did this happen to me? But that why is double-faced. You'll see what I mean shortly. He says, let the day perish in which I was born. This is lament language. I wish I'd never been born. He says, why did I not die at birth rather than experience this? He says, why is life given to one in misery who longs for death, but that it does not come? I want to be sensitive here. All of us have struggles, and I don't want this to be a trigger for anyone. But in the Old Testament and in the ancient world in general, suicide was it's just not a thing you do. Okay, it's not unheard of. So Job considers himself kind of trapped in, kind of hedged in, and he'll use that language. He's not, he'll say this. Actually, he won't. Someone else. Cursed be the day on which I was born. The day when my mother bore me, let it not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father, saying, a child is born to you, a son, making him very glad. Why did I come forth from the womb to see toil and sorrow and spend my days in shame? This is not Job. This is the prophet Jeremiah, whose life became a nightmare because God told him to say these words of prophecy to the Judeans in Jerusalem. And it brought him untold suffering, it brought him dejection, it brought him rejection, it brought him failure. And you see an analogy here, but the analogy is not simply the situation of Jeremiah and Job. The analogy is also the language, because it's likely the book of Job is deliberately borrowing language from the book of Jeremiah. When Job says, let the day perish in which I was born, cursed be the day on which I was born, and the night that said a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb, and just expire? Okay, so this is part of his lament. Something to bear in mind, the book of Job, cases like this, many others, is evidently drawing upon other parts of Scripture in order to put a little twist on them. often not a happy twist. This is a borrowing. Jeremiah is lamenting because of the effect of the word of the Lord in his life. It's not a happy effect in his life. This is Jeremiah. Job is lamenting for the exact opposite. There is no word of the Lord in his life. He just has calamity with no way of understanding it or explaining it. You see the absence of the word of the Lord. So we have two different experiences eliciting the same human response. Why does this have to happen? Now, the why thing is pregnant. We're going to give birth a little bit later in today's session. We could talk about more, but here's Jeremiah 20, and there's Job 3. So let's examine closely, or make sure we understand what Job is saying and what he's not saying. In his lament, Job asks, "Why is light given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in?" Now the reader, not Job, but the reader will recognize a clever thing that the writer is doing here. Whom God has fenced in, put a hedge around. This is the identical language that the Satan used to describe how God had protected Job from calamity with a hedge built around him. He said, remove the hedge, remember? So the Satan said, and you'll find Job will curse you. Now, Job uses the same language to talk about how calamitous it is to be hedged in by mortality and suffering without any light to illuminate, you see. So it's a clever thing that the reader is being treated to, although the characters are not. But here's what Job is not doing. He is lamenting his fate, yes, but he's not trying to make his suffering intelligible. His why is not it's not what caused this. It's to what purpose. You see how why goes either way. When we say why, what are you asking? Are you asking how this came to be? Or are you asking for what this came to be? Do you see the difference between the two sides of the word why? Book of Job revolves around this. He's not trying to make his suffering intelligible. He's not trying to understand it. He's just lamenting his suffering. He does not consider himself being punished for any sin. Never says a word of that in his chapter 3 lament. And moreover, retributive theology is not Job's God speak, not his theology, not his God talk in chapter 3, which is his lament. Are we all dialed into retributive theology? You know, God gives as reward for your piety. This is what Satan was challenging. Satan was making his whole point on the basis of retributive theology assumed. This is not in Job's theological mentality at first. Then things begin to change. The question being, can God maintain integrity vis-a-vis suffering? And we were wrestling with the question of how to theologically account for suffering. Okay, that question is not Job's question at first, but it will become his question. In a Mesopotamian text, this problem of how do we theologically account for suffering, this is a widespread issue. So, ancient Near East, we look at a Mesopotamian text from about 1500 BC. And here's the recommendation. Every day, worship your God, present your free will offering to your God, for this is proper toward the gods. Prayer, supplication, prostration, offer them daily, and you will get your reward. You see the retributive theology? Do these pious acts and you will get your reward. So it's not just biblical. This is a universal thing under certain theistic frameworks. You will have communion with your God. Reverence begets favor. Sacrifice prolongs life. Prayer atones for guilt. So this is we might say it the standard, almost the default response to accounting for suffering theologically. Let me be clear. Accounting for human suffering in terms of the divine. Here's one solution. The book of Deuteronomy takes that ball of retributive theology and runs for a touchdown. Okay. Book of Deuteronomy is on every page, if you obey God and do what God says, you will be blessed. And if you don't obey God's commandments, which I am commanding you this day, Moses says, you will be cursed. You will be afflicted. You will fail. There is virtually not a gram of allowance for any other deviance from that strict retributive theology of the book of Deuteronomy. We might put it this way. In the beginning was Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy was without chaos. And every good act led to a good consequence, and every evil act led to an evil consequence. And the world had order, and it was not void, and God saw that it was good and easy for humans to understand. Okay? And that's why this is a super popular theology, because it does make order of things. Now, that's aside from its truth. But it gives a certain sense of order and reliability, and I can make my way in the world, because after all, every evil act leads to an evil consequence, and all I have to do is make sure that I do good acts and I will enjoy good consequences. So this is Deuteronomy and many other parts of the Hebrew Bible, as I said. How is this known, by the way? In a different part of the Hebrew Bible called the wisdom literature, the book of Proverbs would be the one to think of, this same theology is baked into the wisdom that's taught. If you live wisely, and here's how you do it, if you live a certain way, the result will be success. This is the entire mentality of the book of Proverbs. Okay, and that's different from the book of Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy has to do with the commandments of God. My point is, this general retributive theology perspective is the product, usually, of simply observing. The world does tend to work according to cause and effect. If I drop this clicker, it's predictable what will happen. This action will produce a certain consequence. And so the world generally seems to work that way. So we humans, we extrapolate from that and say, well, that's the way it works with God too. You act certain ways, you enjoy or you experience certain consequences. So we're dialed in. One of Job's friends, Eliphaz, just verbalizes this. Eliphaz says, think now, who was ever innocent that perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, see that language, as I have observed, as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. So there you have a fairly representative articulation by Eliphaz, and he's speaking for the friends. Just say this sort of thing to Job over and over and over and over and over. And that is, this is how we understand your situation. This is that triangle I mentioned. We kind of worked this out last week. The view of God's justice held by Job's friends. They maintain God is all good. This is not something that an evil God has done to you. God is all good, Job. And God is all powerful. That includes, by the way, knowing everything and able to do everything. But they deny the reality of innocent suffering. Remember last week, this was the conundrum. This was the philosophical problem. How to reconcile an all-good God, an all-powerful God, and the reality of innocent suffering. One response is just to deny there's any such thing as innocent suffering. And this is where Eliphaz is coming from, Bildad, Zophar, the friends of Job. This is essentially their theology. Are we good? So this is a monotheism. There is one God. This one God is good, and this one God is all-powerful. And so what's the problem? There isn't one, as long as we disregard the reality of, just deny the reality of an innocent suffering. So Job's God speak shows he is now considering his situation as something God has done to him. The friends start speaking to him in terms of retributive theology. Remember, Job did not originally frame his situation in that understanding. Recall? He was just lamenting, this is terrible. I wish I were dead. This is awful. Okay. Now his friends have brought a frame of making his suffering understandable, intelligible. So now he begins to consider his situation that way. And as he does so, he says, okay, in that case, the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Does the wild ass bray over its grass and the ox low over its fodder? Now, this is one of the challenges of reading the book of Job. The poetry, you have to get into the poetry. So what's he saying here? First of all, this takes serious. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. Okay, so God is now my enemy? God's doing this to me? Remember, his lament didn't say that. Influenced by his friends, he said, God has done this to me? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't work in the way of the natural order. A wild ass does not bray when it's got food right in front of it. It brays when it doesn't have food. The ox doesn't low when it has its food. It lows when it doesn't have food. Job's saying, this doesn't make sense in the natural order that God's in charge of. For him to shoot arrows at me, it doesn't fit. But you see what he's doing. He's considering his situation in terms of God did this to you for some reason, for your iniquity. Okay, so Job's beginning to consider this. God has done this to me. His friend Bildad comes back and says, does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children have sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. Now again, the reader knows how cruel this is, because the reader knows from the prologue that Job's children were innocent, and they were not killed because of anything they did. We know from God's own mouth they were killed chinam, for no reason. Remember how that bitter barb in the first part of the book? But Bildad just kind of reasons backwards. Here's how it works. If there is suffering, remember there's no innocent suffering. That they erased that, remember? If there's suffering, we can just reason back to some sin that caused the suffering, so that the suffering is always deserved, you see, and God is just. Human choice is the source of human suffering in this theology represented by the friends. Therefore, human choice is the cure. If you will seek God and make supplication to the Almighty, if you're pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore you to your rightful place. You see, it's a watertight system. All you have to do is get right with God, God gets right with you, and the world is a wonderful place. You're following the theology, right? The reader then has to consider, okay, let's play this out. Let's say Job follows the directive of his friends and repents. Why? He will restore you to your rightful place. And the Satan was right. He's only serving you, God, because his circumstances are pleasant. Make his circumstances unpleasant, he will curse you. And so if Job does this and repents of his alleged sin, why will he have done that? To improve his situation, just like the Satan said. So the reader knows this is not an option for Job. Okay. And Job knows this as well. And Job vociferously insists, correctly, by the way, I have nothing to repent of here. I am not evil. And by the way, God had acknowledged that at the beginning of the book. There's no fault in Job here. So what Job begins to do, since this is not possible, is he begins to consider his situation in legal terms. If I could get my day in court, if I could just approach God, like in a courtroom setting, and he starts using all kinds of language like winning a suit, I'm innocent, declaring or guilty or not, a trial, lawsuit, like this kind of language begins to pepper his speech as we go through these endless chapters of Job and the friends and Job and the friends. Justice, lawsuit, litigation, legal adversary, plea, state charges, legal arbiter, summon, guiltless. His language becomes filled with legal terminology, telling us that he's imagining the possibility, if I could just address God directly in court, we could get this thing worked out. Okay. Expressing, by the way, that he has some view that God is possibly just, but the problem is, he says, I would lay my case before him. I would fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me, and I would understand what he would say to me. But the problem is, that's impossible. He is utterly unique. Who can argue with him or dissuade him? Whatever he desires, that's what he does, and I'm terrified at his presence. So Job is considering a certain approach to his situation, and he realizes that option is not open to me. What option? Confronting God directly is not an option. Why? Well, because of the ontological distance between human and God. He says so. Who can possibly do that? And there's an unbridgeable ontological distance between Job, who is every man. Remember, this is the universal human problem. Who of us would not like to have an audience with God and get a few things worked out? This is a universal longing. And Job is every man, you see. He says, how can a mortal be just before God? If one wished to contend with him, there's that legal language, one could not answer him once in 1,000. He's wise in heart, mighty in strength. Who has resisted him and succeeded? He removes mountains. They don't even know it. When he overturns them in his anger, he shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. So he's just elaborating poetically on the utter ontological impossibility. Ontological means by the nature of being. That can't happen because of this unbridgeable distance between every human and God. And since the options are closed, repenting is not an option, not with integrity. Do you really want someone to apologize when they know it's not a sincere apology? See how false that is? In Job's integrity, he will not endorse that falseness, a false repentance. So that's not an option. In directly encountering God, directly inquiring of God, that's not an option. So in his despair, wishing to contend with God and unable to succeed, he says, I am blameless. I don't know my own self. I hate my life. Look at this, friends. How can this be? That a person who is blameless would hate his life. It's supposed to be the other way around. A person who is blameless should enjoy her life. Okay, this is what drives people crazy. This is the fundamental Joban motif that I mentioned earlier. I don't know, and therefore he's torn existentially. I don't know what to do with this. My situation is intolerable and it is inexplicable. The why of cause is not relevant because there is no cause. The why of purpose is not available because I can't get an audience with God. So I'm torn. And this is the universal human situation that everyone finds themselves in. It's all one. So I say, blameless and wicked alike, he destroys alike. And this is a powerful accusation. Job's concluding, I have no other choice but to conclude. In other words, how do I relate God to my suffering? God just distributes suffering regardless of the human condition. Regardless of blameless or wicked, God just distributes the consequences as God will. He destroys them all alike. He's in an intolerable no man's land. And so this presses the question dealt with here. How can God maintain integrity in the face of calamity? Job says, I don't know. Doesn't seem like that would to me. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers his eyes of the judges. If it's not he's looking at the corruption in the world, which, by the way, may rate in our world right now as the number one problem of the entire world, and that is corruption. That's a whole other subject. But Job perceived it, and he says, okay, so if it's not God who is having all this corruption ruin everything, then who? This is a profound challenge to common notions of theology. So he reasons the world, is poorly governed by God. Zophar says, that God would speak and open his lips to you, Job. He would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for wisdom is many-sided. Know that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Well, this is extraordinary. And by the way, this shows you the bankruptcy of retributive theology. Because in retributive theology, if you have a situation like Job's, the facts will not support your view of God, so you have to make up some facts. And this is exactly what Zophar is doing. God knows everything, you see. God is all good. God is all powerful, which means God knows you, and you actually are getting less than you really deserve, Job. You're that wicked. And this is just a denial of innocent suffering, as we saw earlier. The implication then is that all suffering is punishment. Okay? And this is an untenable theology. We know that's not true. Visit CHOC, Children's Hospital of Orange County, and tell me all suffering is deserved. But this is what people believe. And this is the issue that the book of Job is struggling with. So Job says so. He says to his friends, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Cracks me up why we call them his friends. Have windy words no limit. What provokes you that you keep on talking? What is at stake here? That they will fabricate reality to preserve their theology. Not that we ever do that. So it's worth considering as we wind things up here, what's really at stake here? Why do people do this? And the answer is this. Bildad tells us, Job, how long will you hunt for words? You who tear yourself in your anger. Shall the earth be forsaken because of you? Or the rock be removed out of its place? And this is an image of the globe kind of dissolving and breaking apart. What's at stake here is an entire worldview is at stake here. The world is ordered a certain way in our conception. And as long as we can make our way through life according to the construct of our worldview, here's how and why things happen, okay, everything's fine. But when something comes along and challenges our worldview, we get very upset. Okay, we don't have a lot of time. But have you ever wondered why people get their panties such in a bunch about gender and marriage? It's a worldview question. The world is ordered, you see, by the divine so that certain genders are discrete and marriage is aligned with certain gender distinctions and so forth. And when something comes along and challenges that question, it's not just a marriage question, it's not just a gender question, it's a whole worldview that's being challenged. And we are humans and we are not sinful for clinging to our worldviews because we find refuge there, we find safety there, we find comfort in our worldviews, which is why when our worldviews are questioned or shattered, we are quite vulnerable. We are quite at a loss. This is Bildad. He's speaking for all of us because we are all in that situation. You see what I'm saying? That's why they dig in their heels and just accuse Job of all kinds of things which are completely false. It's a matter of keeping a worldview intact. That's why worldview questions generate unrealistic fanaticism in our experience. So, Job concludes, why are times for judgment not reserved by the Almighty? Even those close to him cannot foresee his actions. From the city, the dying groan, and the throat of the wounded cries for help, and yet God pays no attention to their prayer. Job is concluding then, God is unjust. And he's asking for questions. Watch, he says, if this is not so, God as an unjust sovereign over the universe, if that's not so, then prove me wrong. Okay? So Job has I don't want to say he's matured, but he certainly has developed from his first, he's just lamenting, and then his friends come along and say, you deserve this, so he thinks in terms of deserving, and he says, no, that doesn't make any sense. God is, if you're going to bring God in the equation, then God is the loser in this equation because God is an unjust sovereign on the basis of my situation. So I promised we'd come back and give birth to the baby called the word why. Remember? So let's revisit this. We have God, we have suffering. God plus suffering creates this question. Why? Okay. Job did not first ask that question. He just said, why do I have to live in this situation? He didn't ask, why did this happen, or to what purpose did this happen? So this question has created a small industry of what we call apologetics. And apologetics is sometimes done well, sometimes done poorly. So here you have a title, Is God a Moral Monster? By a certain theologian. Or Suffering and the Goodness of God. These are contemporary book titles that they're modern, if I may. These are modern versions of the issues that the ancient book of Job is treating. It's a perennial issue that we constantly confront. Here's another one. Why all people suffer. How a loving God uses suffering to perfect us. Now, here you see a range of responses. This is very academic. So it has to do with ancient Near Eastern culture and the literature of the Old Testament. This is more theological, suffering and the goodness of God. This is more pastoral, why all people suffer. And by the way, this is one of the tacks taken by Job's friends, especially Elihu, says, God's trying to teach you through your suffering, Job. Here is another one by Elizabeth Elliot. Suffering is never for nothing. Now, this is very interesting. Remember Chinam? You pressed me, Satan, to afflict Job Chinam, for nothing, without cause. Elizabeth Elliot and a whole pastoral way of thinking suggests suffering is never for nothing. That captures the ambiguity. Suffering is not caused by nothing, or suffering has no eventual purpose, nothing. So it's a fascinating angle on the core question of the book of Job. And finally, considering Job, this is brand new of this year, reconciling sovereignty and suffering. That is to say, the sovereignty of God as a good governor of the universe and innocent human suffering. It would be great if God would speak up, and the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, what? You'll have to come back next week.